Someone told you it appears 365 times. One for every day of the year. One for every morning you wake up afraid. You have probably seen it on a coffee mug, or heard it from a pulpit, or read it in a devotional with a sunrise on the cover. 365 times God said, "Do not be afraid." One reminder waiting for you every single day of the year. It is a beautiful thought. It is also not true. Scholars who have gone through every translation, the Hebrew, the Aramaic, the Greek, counting every instance of the command in its various forms, land on a number closer to 144. Some counts go slightly higher, some slightly lower, depending on how you handle the synonyms and the near equivalents. But 365? That number is a legend. A devotional legend, told with good intentions, repeated with warm hearts, and passed from pulpit to pulpit until it felt like fact. Here is what I want you to understand before we go any further. The real number is more interesting than the legend. Because when you actually sit down and read every single one of those moments, every scene, every character, every impossible situation where God leaned down and spoke those two words into a terrified person and Apos' life, what you find is not a calendar. What you find is a pattern, a fingerprint, a way that God moves that has not changed in 4,000 years of recorded history. And there is one moment, one specific night on a black volcanic island in the middle of the Aegean Sea, where God says it in a way he has never said it before or since. We will get to that moment, but not yet. First, let Apos' go back to where it started. The year is somewhere around 2090 BC, and a woman named Hagar is sitting in a desert. She is not a prophet. She is not a king. She is not even an Israelite. She is an Egyptian slave, and she has been used and dismissed and sent away into the wilderness of Beersheba with nothing but a skin of water and a boy, her son, Ishmael, who is now dying of thirst in the shrubs. The water is gone. She sets the boy down under a bush, walks about a bowshot away, and sits down, because she cannot watch him die. The text in Genesis 21 says she lifted her voice and wept. Not prayed, not called out to God. She wept. She had given up. And into that silence, that complete, hollow silence of a mother who has run out of options, the angel of God calls to her from heaven. And quote, "What is wrong, Hagar? Do not be afraid." End quote. Pay attention to this. This is the first time in the Bible that God says these words directly to a person in crisis. And he does not say them to Abraham. He does not say them to Sarah. He says them to a foreign slave woman who has been abandoned in the desert. God does not begin this pattern with the powerful. He begins it with the discarded. The Hebrew word here is al-tira, the command form, meaning in quote, "Stop fearing," end quote, or in quote, "Keep not fearing," end quote. It is not a suggestion. It is not a comfort offered gently from a distance. It is a direct address. God sees exactly where Hagar is, and he speaks directly into her worst moment, and he tells her the fear does not have to stay. Then he shows her a well. She had been so locked inside her grief that she could not see it. The water was already there. She just needed someone to open her eyes. Now, not long before Hagar and Apos' story, the text places Abram and Apos' encounter earlier in Genesis. God speaks these words for what scholars consider the first recorded direct instance in Scripture. Abram has just come back from battle. He has fought kings. He has rescued his nephew Lot. And you might think that after a military victory, a man would feel strong, confident, safe. But that is not what the text shows you. The word of the Lord comes to Abram in a vision, and the very first thing God says is this, end quote, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield," end quote. Which means Abram was afraid. After the battle, after the victory, he is lying awake, and the fear has found him in the dark, the fear that the kings he defeated will come back, the fear that he has no heir, the fear that all of it amounts to nothing. And God opens with, "I see what is keeping you awake. Do not be afraid." Here is what most people miss. God does not say, end quote, "Do not be afraid," end quote, to people who have their lives together. He says it to people who are alone in a desert with a dying child. He says it to people who won the battle but still cannot sleep. He says it to people at the absolute end of what they can manage on their own. The pattern has already begun, and it is only going to get larger. The next time you see the pattern, it is bigger. Everything is bigger. The man is not alone in a tent at night. He is standing at the edge of a sea with 600 chariots behind him, and 2 million people screaming at his back that he has led them out here to die. His name is Moses, and the moment is one of the most dramatic in all of human history. You know the story, but let me slow it down, because there is something in this scene that most retellings skip past. The Israelites have just left Egypt. Pharaoh has released them, and then changed his mind. His army is closing in. The sea is in front of them. There is nowhere to go. And the people turn on Moses with words that cut like a blade. And quote, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." End quote. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, records in his Antiquities of the Jews that the panic at the sea was total. The people were not merely worried. They were in open revolt. Some were calling for Moses to be stoned. Some were running in every direction, looking for any way out that was not the sea and was not the army. And Moses says 5 words. And quote, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm." End quote. Think about the audacity of that sentence. Think about what it costs to say those words in that moment. The chariots are visible on the horizon. The people are screaming. And Moses, who has his own fear, who is not a soldier, who began this whole journey by arguing with a burning bush because he did not think he was the right man for this. Moses plants his feet and says, "Do not be afraid." He is not saying it because he is not afraid. He is saying it because he has heard it before. He is passing forward what God gave him in the desert of Midian, at the burning bush, when God said to him then, and quote, "Do not be afraid. Take off your sandals. The ground you are standing on is holy," end quote. Stay with me. This is the second layer of the pattern. It is not just that God says, end quote, "Do not be afraid," end quote, to people in crisis. It is that the people who receive it are then asked to say it to someone else. The comfort is not meant to stay in one person. It moves. It passes forward. Hagar received it and lived. Abram received it and became a nation. Moses received it, and now he is standing at the edge of an impossible sea, handing it to 2 million people who need it more than he does. The sea opens, and the pattern moves forward another generation. His name is Gideon, and he is hiding. The text in Judges 6 is almost darkly funny. The angel of the Lord appears to Gideon while he is threshing wheat, not out in the open field where wheat is normally threshed, where the wind can carry away the chaff, but down in a winepress. Underground. Hidden. Because the Midianites have been raiding Israel and Apos, crops for 7 years, and Gideon is not about to let them take the grain. The angel greets him, and quote, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior," end quote. And Gideon, this man hiding in a hole in the ground, looks up and says, essentially, "If the Lord is with us, why has all of this happened to us?" It is one of the most honest questions in all of Scripture. And God does not answer it. Not directly. He simply gives Gideon a commission. Go. Save Israel. I am sending you. And Gideon pushes back, the way everyone in this story pushes back, the way you have probably pushed back yourself when you felt something pulling you towards something that felt too large for who you are. My clan is the weakest in Manasseh. I am the least in my family. Why me? And God says, end quote, "Peace. Do not be afraid. You will not die," end quote. Not a strategy, not a battle plan, not an explanation of the odds. Just peace. Do not be afraid. You will not die. Gideon goes on to defeat an army of 135,000 with 300 men carrying torches and clay jars. But that victory begins here, underground, with a frightened man and 4 words. Now watch what happens next. The pattern does not stay in narrative. It moves into the poets, into the prophets, into the places where God speaks not just to one person in one crisis, but to a whole nation in exile. Isaiah 41, verse 10, one of the most quoted verses in the entire Old Testament. God is speaking to Israel in the shadow of Babylonian conquest, to people who have lost their temple, their city, their king, their land. And he says, and quote, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand," end quote. The Hebrew word translated in quote, dismayed in quote, here is shah. It means to look around in panic, to spin in every direction searching for a way out. God is describing the exact physical posture of someone in crisis. Eyes darting, heart hammering, looking for an exit that does not exist. And he says, stop looking around. Look at me. But there is one more moment in the Old Testament that I do not want you to miss, because it is the strangest one, and it may be the most important one for anyone who has ever prayed and heard nothing back. The man is Daniel. The year is approximately 536 BC. Daniel is an old man now. He has survived Nebuchadnezzar, survived the lions and Apos, Den, survived the fall of Babylon and the rise of Persia. He has been fasting and mourning for 3 weeks. 21 days of prayer with no answer. And then a figure appears on the bank of the Tigris River. The description in Daniel 10 is overwhelming. A man clothed in linen, a belt of pure gold, a body like chrysolite, a face like lightning, eyes like flaming torches, arms and legs like burnished bronze, a voice like the sound of a multitude. Daniel and Apos, as companions, flee. Daniel himself falls face down, completely drained of strength. The figure touches him and says, and quote, "Do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard." End quote. Since the first day, the prayer was heard on day 1. The answer was delayed 21 days because of a spiritual conflict Daniel could not see, could not feel, and had no way of knowing about. For 3 weeks, he prayed into what felt like silence. For 3 weeks, he could have concluded that God was not listening, that the prayer was bouncing off the ceiling, that he was doing something wrong. And the answer, when it finally comes, opens with, "Do not be afraid. Your words were heard." Since the first day, here in Apos, that's the part nobody tells you. Sometimes the silence is not absence. Sometimes the silence is a battle happening in a dimension you cannot access, over a prayer that was received the moment you prayed it. Daniel and Apos' story does not explain every silence, but it does permanently disqualify the conclusion that silence means God is not there. Something is happening that you cannot see, and the pattern is deepening. God says, "Do not be afraid," to the abandoned, to the overwhelmed, to the hiding, to the exiled, to the one who has been praying for 3 weeks and heard nothing. And then everything changes, because God is about to stop sending messengers. He is about to come himself. The temple in Jerusalem is the most sacred building on earth. At its center is a room called the Holy of Holies, a cube of perfect dimensions, 30 feet in every direction, where the presence of God is said to dwell. No one enters it except the high priest. No one enters it except once a year, on the Day of Atonement. And even then, tradition says the priest ties a rope around his ankle before he goes in, so that if God strikes him dead in the presence of holiness, someone can drag the body out without entering themselves. This is the world Zechariah lives in. He is a priest, old now, and his wife Elizabeth is old, and the dream they carried for decades, a child, a son, an heir, has quietly died the way long-deferred hopes die. Not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, year after year of nothing, until you stop expecting and start simply enduring. His division is on duty at the temple. The lot has fallen to him, the once-in-a-lifetime honor, to enter the sanctuary and burn incense before the Lord. The people are outside, praying, waiting, and Zechariah goes in. And there, standing at the right side of the altar of incense, is an angel. The text says Zechariah was gripped with fear. The Greek word Luke uses here is toio, a sudden, startling terror, the kind that stops your body before your mind catches up. And before Zechariah can move, before he can speak, before he can do anything at all, the angel says, end quote, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah," end quote. The angel and Apos' name, we learn in the next breath, is Gabriel. He has been in the presence of God. He stands before God, and the first thing out of his mouth, the very first thing this being of fire and light and impossible nearness to the throne says to a terrified old priest, is, "Do not be afraid. Your prayer has been heard. Elizabeth will bear a son. You will call him John." Zechariah and Apos' response is so deeply human that it almost makes you smile. He has been a priest his entire life. He has served in the temple. He knows the stories of Hagar and Abram and Moses and Gideon. He knows the pattern, and he still says, end quote, "How can I be sure of this? I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years," end quote. Gabriel and Apos' answer is swift and a little dry. "I stand in the presence of God. I was sent to tell you this. And since you did not believe my words, You will be silent until the day this happens. Zechariah walks out of the temple unable to speak. The people outside can see that something has happened to him. He can only make signs with his hands. And he goes home to his wife, and 9 months later, Elizabeth is pregnant. And she says, in the quiet of her house, in words that have echoed across 2,000 years, end quote, "The Lord has done this for me," end quote. 6 months after that, in a hill town in Galilee, Gabriel goes again. But this time, God does not send him to a temple. He does not send him to a priest or a king or a military commander or a prophet with decades of experience. He sends him to a teenage girl in a one-room house in Nazareth, a town so obscure that when Nathanael hears about it later, his first response is, end quote, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" End quote. Her name is Mary. She is probably between 13 and 16 years old, which was the normal age for betrothal in first-century Jewish culture. She is engaged to a man named Joseph. Her life, as far as anyone can see, is already mapped out. Small town, simple life, nothing remarkable on the horizon. And then the room fills with presence. Gabriel greets her with words that have no precedent in Scripture. He does not open with, end quote, "Do not be afraid," end quote, not yet. He opens with something stranger, end quote, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you," end quote. The text says Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this could be. She is not afraid of the angel, not yet. She is troubled by what he said. She is already thinking, already trying to understand. And then Gabriel says it, end quote, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God," end quote. The Greek here is me phobou, the present imperative, meaning not just, end quote, "Do not be afraid right now," end quote, but, end quote, "Keep not being afraid. Let this be your ongoing posture," end quote. It is not a one-time reassurance. It is an invitation into a way of living. What follows is the most world-altering conversation in human history. You will conceive and give birth to a son. He will be great. He will be called the Son of the Most High. His kingdom will never end. And Mary, this teenage girl in a hill town nobody important had ever visited, says 6 words that have been spoken in churches for 2,000 years. End quote. "Let it be unto me according to your word," end quote. Not after a long argument. Not after demanding a sign, the way Zechariah did. 6 words. And history pivots on them. But God is not finished speaking for that night. Not far away, in the fields outside a small city called Bethlehem, a group of shepherds are doing what shepherds do in the middle of the night, watching, keeping the darkness back, listening for predators. It is ordinary work, unglamorous work, work that no one writes songs about unless something extraordinary happens to interrupt it. And then the sky breaks open. An angel of the Lord appears, and the glory of the Lord shines around them, and the shepherds are terrified. The Greek word Luke chooses is ephobethison phobon megan. They feared a great fear. As if the ordinary word for fear was not large enough for what happened to them, and Luke had to stack it on top of itself. They feared. A great fear. And the angel says, end quote, "Do not be afraid," end quote. And then, and I want you to feel the weight of this, the angel says something that has never been said before in the history of the world. End quote. "I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today in the town of David a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord." End quote. Every previous end quote, "Do not be afraid," end quote, in Scripture pointed forward to this moment. Every one of them was preparation. Hagar survived so her son could live. Abram trusted so a nation could be born. Moses stood firm so a people could be freed. Gideon fought so Israel could have peace. Isaiah spoke so the exiles could hold on. Daniel prayed so the faithful would know their prayers are heard. All of it, every single word of reassurance across 2,000 years of human history, was pointing here. To a field. To a group of working men. To a sky full of angels. To a baby in a feeding trough. And God is still not finished. Because now he is not going to send angels anymore. He is going to speak the words himself. The Sea of Galilee is not a gentle body of water. It sits in a basin surrounded by hills, and when the wind comes down through those hills at night, it comes fast, and it comes without warning. Experienced fishermen, men who have spent their entire lives on this water, have drowned in it. The lake is 13 miles long and 8 miles wide, and in the dark, in a storm, 8 miles of open water is more than enough to kill you. Peter knows this lake. He has fished it since he was a boy. He knows what it sounds like when a real storm comes in. He knows the difference between rough water and dangerous water. This is dangerous water. The disciples are in the boat. Jesus has sent them ahead while he went up on the mountainside alone to pray. It is somewhere between 3 and 6 in the morning, the fourth watch of the night. The text says, which is the darkest stretch, the hours when the body is most exhausted and the mind is least defended against fear. The wind is against them. The waves are breaking over the sides of the boat. They have been rowing for hours, and they are going nowhere. And then they see something on the water. A figure, moving toward them, walking on the surface of the sea as though the storm is not happening, as though the waves are a floor and the wind is nothing, as though the entire natural order has simply arranged itself to accommodate the pace of whoever this is. And the disciples are terrified. They think it is a ghost. The Greek word Matthew uses is phantasma, a phantom, an apparition, something that should not exist in the world of solid things. They cry out in fear. And immediately, not after a pause, not after letting them suffer in the terror for a moment, immediately Jesus speaks. And quote, "Take courage. Do not be afraid," end quote. The word translated in quote, "take courage," end quote, is tharsio in Greek. It means more than comfort. It means, end quote, be of good cheer, be bold, have confidence, end quote. It is an active word. Jesus is not just telling them the fear can leave. He is telling them something stronger can replace it. And then Peter, because Peter is always Peter, shouts back across the storm, end quote, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water," end quote. Jesus says one word, end quote, "Come," end quote. And Peter gets out of the boat. Stay with me, because this is where most people stop the story. They focus on Peter sinking. They focus on the moment he looks at the waves and goes under. And yes, Jesus reaches out and catches him. And yes, Jesus says, end quote, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" end quote. But do not miss what happened before that. Peter walked on water. Not Jesus. Peter, a fisherman from Galilee. A man with calloused hands and a loud voice and more impulse than patience. This man stepped out of a boat in the middle of a storm on the word of one person, and for some number of steps, the water held him. He got out of the boat because Jesus said, "Do not be afraid," and something in him believed it enough to move. The fear came back. Of course it came back. It always comes back. But the first step happened. And that first step, taken in the dark, in the storm, on the word of someone who had already told him not to fear, that step is worth more than most sermons. Now the scene shifts, and the stakes climb higher. 6 days later, Jesus takes Peter and James and John up a high mountain. The text does not name the mountain, but tradition places it at Mount Tabor, a dome of limestone rising nearly 2,000 feet above the Jezreel Valley. They go up alone, and when they reach the top, something happens that none of the three men will fully be able to explain for the rest of their lives. Jesus is transfigured before them. His face shines like the sun. His clothes become white as light. And then two figures appear beside him, Moses and Elijah, the two great pillars of the Hebrew faith, the law and the prophets, standing in conversation with Jesus on a mountaintop in Galilee, as though they never left. Peter, who has not yet learned that some moments do not require words, suggests building 3 shelters. While he is still speaking, a bright cloud covers them, and a voice comes from the cloud, not an angel and Apos. S voice, not Gabriel and Apos. S voice, but a voice the disciples have heard only once before, at the Jordan River when Jesus was baptized. And quote, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." End quote. The disciples fall face down on the ground. They are terrified. The Greek is idiothesin sphodra. They feared exceedingly, intensely, with their whole bodies. This is not the polite anxiety of someone who has received unexpected news. This is the terror of human beings in the direct, unmediated presence of divine glory. And then someone touches them. Not the voice, not the cloud. A hand, a human hand, gentle, on their shoulders. And a voice they know, the voice they have heard teach in synagogues and on hillsides and in fishing boats, says, and quote, "Get up. Do not be afraid," end quote. They look up, and there is no one there except Jesus. Just Jesus. And here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. The voice from the cloud said, "Listen to him." And the first thing Jesus says after the voice is, "Do not be afraid." This is not coincidence. The Father is saying, if you want to know what I sound like, listen to my Son. And the Son opens his mouth, and the first thing he says is the same thing God has been saying since Hagar wept alone in a desert. Do not be afraid. It is the same voice. It has always been the same voice. But there is one more person who needs to hear it before we reach the end. His name is Paul, and the city is Corinth. Paul has been in Corinth for some time. He will end up staying 18 months total, but the early weeks are brutal. Corinth is a port city, one of the most morally complex cities in the Roman world, and Paul is not getting traction. He is working as a tent maker during the day to support himself. He is preaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath and getting into arguments that go nowhere. He has already been beaten in other cities. He has been stoned and left for dead in Lystra. He has been thrown in prison in Philippi. He is tired in a way that sleep cannot fix. And one night, in Corinth, Jesus speaks to him in a vision. And quote, "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city." End quote. 3 commands in one sentence. Do not be afraid. Keep speaking. Do not be silent. And notice what God does not say. He does not say Corinth will be easy. He does not say no one will oppose you. He does not promise a smooth road, or a large crowd, or immediate results. He says, I am with you, and there are people here who belong to me, and your job is to find them. Paul stays. He preaches. The church in Corinth becomes one of the largest and most complicated churches in the entire New Testament. Complicated enough that Paul will write them 2 very long letters trying to sort out everything that has gone wrong. But it begins here, with a tired man in a hard city who hears 3 words in the night and decides to stay. And that brings us to the island. The black volcanic island in the Aegean Sea that I told you about at the beginning. The one where God says it in a way he has never said it before. We are almost there. The island of Patmos is about 8 miles long and 5 miles wide. It is shaped roughly like a crescent, volcanic rock rising from the Aegean Sea in jagged black formations, with almost no flat land and almost no fresh water. The Romans used it as a penal colony, a place to send people who were not worth executing but too dangerous to leave free. No walls needed. No guards at every door. The sea itself is the prison. The man they have sent here is old. His name is John. He is the last surviving apostle. Every other man who walked with Jesus during those 3 years in Galilee and Judea has been killed. Peter, crucified upside down in Rome. James, beheaded by Herod. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Simon, Thaddeus, gone, one by one, across 30 years of persecution. John alone remains, and the Emperor Domitian has decided that exile is sufficient punishment for a man this age. Eusebius, the 4th century church historian, records in his ecclesiastical history that John was brought to Rome before his exile and subjected to torture, and emerged unharmed. Whether you take that detail literally or not, what Eusebius is documenting is a man who has already survived more than most people will ever face, and who is now, at the end of his life, alone on a rock in the middle of the sea. It is the Lord and Apos, Este. John is in the Spirit, praying, worshiping, whatever it means when a man like John enters that place of communion with God. And then, behind him, a sound, a trumpet, then a voice like the sound of rushing waters, like many waters all at once. The book of Revelation says John turns to see who is speaking, and what he sees is this, 7 golden lampstands, and in the middle of them, someone like a son of man, robed to his feet, a golden sash around his chest, hair white as wool, white as snow, eyes like blazing fire, feet like bronze glowing in a furnace, a face like the sun shining in all its fullness, and in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth a sharp double-edged sword. John does not stand in awe. John does not raise his hands in worship. John, the disciple who leaned against Jesus at the Last Supper, who ran to the empty tomb, who stood at the foot of the cross when everyone else had fled, who has walked with God for 60 years. John falls at his feet as though dead. As though dead. This is not the polite reverence of a church service. This is a human body shutting down in the presence of something so far beyond the scale of ordinary existence that every system John has simply stops. He falls. He cannot move. He cannot speak. And then, a right hand, the same right hand that holds 7 stars, reaches down and touches him. And a voice says 3 words. End quote. Do not be afraid. End quote. Do not be afraid. Here is why this moment is different from every other moment in this entire pattern stretching back for 1,000 years. Here is what I promised you at the beginning. Every previous voice that spoke these words was a messenger, an angel sent from the throne, a prophet carrying the word of someone else. Even Moses, even Isaiah, even Gabriel, they were intermediaries, voices borrowing authority from a source above them. But the voice speaking to John on Patmos is not a messenger. Listen to what the voice says next. And quote, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades." End quote. I was dead, and now I am alive forever and ever. The one saying, "Do not be afraid," is the one who has already gone through the thing we are most afraid of. He did not speak from a safe distance. He did not send comfort from a place of immunity. He went into death itself, into the coldest, darkest, most final thing that exists, and he came out the other side holding the keys. This is the open loop closing. From Hagar in the desert to John on the island, from the first recorded in quote, "Do not be afraid," in quote, to the last, the voice has always been the same voice. But now, on Patmos, in the last book of the Bible, we finally see the face behind the voice. And the face has scars, and the hands that touch John and Apos' trembling shoulders are the same hands that were nailed to a cross outside Jerusalem 60 years before. He is not telling John not to be afraid because fear is unreasonable. He is telling John not to be afraid because he has already faced the worst of it and won. There is a word for what this is. The theologians call it solidarity, God entering into the human condition so completely that when he speaks into our fear, he speaks from inside it, not above it. He is not an observer of human suffering. He is a participant. He is the only being in existence who can say, "I know what death feels like. I know what abandonment feels like. I know what it is to cry out and feel like no one is answering. And I am still here. And I hold the keys." The early church, those men and women who received John and Apos' letter from Patmos and read it aloud in their house churches while the emperor and Apos' torches were still visible from certain hilltops, they knew what this meant. The Didache, one of the earliest Christian texts outside the New Testament, preserves the prayers and practices of communities living under this exact pressure. And what you find in those communities is not people who have found a way to eliminate fear. You find people who have found a reason to keep moving in spite of it. Because the one who told them not to be afraid was not safe and untouched behind a wall of divine immunity. He was marked. He was scarred. He had been through the worst. And he was standing on the other side of it, hand extended, saying, "Come. I know the way. I have been through the dark. I hold the keys." John stands up. He picks up his pen. And he writes the book of Revelation, not a book of terror, despite how it is often read, but a book written to terrified people by a terrified man who has just been touched by the living one and told, "Do not be afraid." You know how this ends. I hold the keys. The pattern that began with a weeping woman in a desert ends here, on a black volcanic island, with an old man on his feet, holding a pen, with the words still warm in the air around him. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. So what do we do with all of this? We have traveled 4,000 years. From a desert in Beersheba to a volcanic island in the Aegean. From a slave woman with a dying child to an old apostle with a pen. From the first recorded in quote, "Do not be afraid," in quote, in Genesis to the last one in Revelation. And the voice has not changed. The instruction has not changed. The one giving it has not changed. But you are still here. And if you are honest, if you are willing to be as honest as Gideon was when he looked up from his hole in the ground and said, in quote, "If God is with us, why has all of this happened?" End quote. Then you know that hearing this pattern does not automatically make the fear go away. So let me give you 3 things to carry out of this. The first one is this. God does not say, in quote, "Do not be afraid," in quote, to people who have nothing to be afraid of. Read the list again. Hagar had a dying child, and no water, and no home to go back to. Abram had won the battle and still could not sleep. Moses had 600 chariots behind him and a sea in front of him. Gideon was hiding underground. Daniel had been praying for 3 weeks into silence. Mary was a teenage girl being asked to carry the weight of human salvation in her body. Paul was exhausted and beaten and getting no traction in a city that did not want him. John was alone on a rock in the middle of the sea at the end of his life, with every friend he had ever made dead before him. These are not people whose circumstances became safe before God spoke. God spoke into the unsafe circumstances. He spoke into the storm, not after it. He spoke into the desert, not after the well appeared. He spoke into the silence, not after the answer came. If you are waiting for your situation to become less frightening before you decide not to be afraid, you have misread the instruction. The command always precedes the miracle. The end quote. Do not be afraid end quote. Always comes before the sea opens, before the army falls, before the water appears, before the answer arrives. Faith is not the feeling you have after things get better. Faith is the step you take while they are still bad. The second thing is harder, and I want you to sit with it. The silence is not evidence of absence. Daniel prayed for 21 days and heard nothing. Not a whisper, not a dream, not a sign. 21 days of what felt like a closed heaven and an empty room. And the answer, when it finally came, opened with, "Your words were heard since the first day." Since the first day. If you have been praying something for a long time, weeks, months, years, and you have heard nothing back, Daniel and Apos' story does not explain everything. It does not give you a timeline. It does not promise the answer is coming tomorrow or next year or in this lifetime. But it does permanently close off one conclusion. It takes off the table the idea that silence means absence, that no answer means no one is listening, that the prayer is bouncing off the ceiling into an empty room. Something is happening that you cannot see. Something is moving in a dimension you do not have access to. And the one who holds the keys of death and Hades, who has been through the worst thing that exists and came out the other side, that one heard your prayer on the first day you prayed it. Keep praying. And the third thing, the one I want to leave you with, the one that I think is the beating heart of this entire pattern across 4,000 years of scripture, is this. The one telling you not to be afraid is not safe. He is not untouched. He is not giving you advice from a position of comfortable immunity, looking down from somewhere clean and bright at your messy, frightened, complicated life. The hands that reached down and touched John and Apos' trembling shoulders on Patmos were scarred hands. The voice that said, end quote, "Do not be afraid, I am the living one," end quote, was the voice of someone who had been dead. Really dead. Not symbolically, not metaphorically. Dead, buried, sealed behind a stone, gone. And he came back. Which means when he says do not be afraid, he is not asking you to pretend the danger is not real. He is not asking you to manufacture a feeling of peace you do not have. He is asking you to trust someone who has already walked through the worst of it and is standing on the other side, hand extended, saying, "I know the way. I have been through the dark. I hold the keys." Hagar saw it at a well in the desert. Abram saw it in a vision at night. Moses saw it at the edge of an impossible sea. Gideon saw it underground in a wine press. Daniel saw it at the end of 3 weeks of silence. Mary saw it in a one-room house in a town nobody important had ever visited. The shepherds saw it in a field at 3 in the morning. Peter saw it on the surface of a storm. 3 disciples saw it on a mountaintop, face down in the dirt, with a hand on their shoulders. Paul saw it in a vision in Corinth on a night when he was too tired to keep going. And John saw it on a black volcanic island at the end of his life, alone, and he fell down as though dead, and a scarred hand touched him, and a voice said, "Do not be afraid." You are watching a channel that believes this pattern matters for real people in real situations. If this video helped you today, if something in here landed in the middle of something you are carrying, share it with someone who needs it. Not because we need the numbers, but because the person you are thinking of right now probably needs to hear that the silence is not absence, and that the one speaking into their fear has already been through the worst of it. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into stories like this. There are more patterns. There are more fingerprints in the text. There are more moments where God shows up in the exact place where human courage has run out. We will be there every time. Do not be afraid.